Dr. Johnson also serves as the founder and president and CEO of the Dare to Imagine Community Development Corporation. Dr. Johnson is a nationally known speaker. And Dr. Johnson has previously served on the boards of the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, the city's Workforce Steering Committee, the Forum for Better Pennsylvania, and previously served as the vice chair of the Board of Trustees of Lincoln University. Dr. Johnson is a commentator on various cable news and other national media programs, including CNN, Fox News, ABC, NBC. He's a proud member of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, and a lifetime member in Morehouse College National Alumni Association. Graduated as a Phi Beta Kappa and Magna Cum Laude scholar at Morehouse and earned his Master of Divinity degree as a Union scholar at the Union Theological Seminary. And then, y'all, he went to Columbia and got a Doctor of Education degree in Organizational Leadership and Transformation Learning. Let's welcome Reverend Dr. Johnson. In the next to Dr. Johnson, we have Rabbi Linda Holtzman, who is a faculty member at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Rabbi Holtzman is the organizer of Tikkun Olam Copper Run, a community that pursues social justice. She also is the former rabbi of Congregation Mishkan Shalom here in Philadelphia, where she had previously served as the interim rabbi and as education director. She also served the Beth Israel congregation in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. She was the first female rabbi to lead that congregation. And she's one of the first rabbis to publicly identify as a lesbian or queer. She served the LGBTQ synagogue Beth Ahava in Philadelphia. And so Rabbi Linda is a leading social justice activist, a founding member of Power, and that's where I think maybe we first met. And is also a founder of the New Sanctuary movement here in Philadelphia, which works to end injustice against immigrants, regardless of their status. At the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Rabbi Linda is the acting director of rabbinic formation and student life. So she works there with students to co-create a vibrant spiritual community and mentors students, helping them navigate their own rabbinic paths, finding internships and rabbinic job placements. So Rabbi Linda is well educated as well, earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Temple, and a Bachelor of Arts in Hebrew Letters from Gratz College, and in 1979 was ordained at RRC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Let's welcome Rabbi Linda. And then finally, we have Imam Kenneth Nuruddin from the Philadelphia Masjid Incorporated. Imam Nuruddin is born and raised in West Philadelphia. Imam Nuruddin attended Philadelphia Catholic and public schools. He's of West Indian descent, the son of a father born in Barbados. He entered the Army at the age of 17 years, served honorably, and was honorably discharged in 1970. He had an experience with the Black Power movement and entered the Nation of Islam in 1972, and immediately began a lifelong pursuit of the Arabic language and the Quran. He was employed by the city of Philadelphia in the Department of Licenses and Inspections and the Records Department, and he was Employee of the Year in 1975. He became the Arabic teacher for Temple 12C in 1976 and became the assistant minister. Also during this time served as a volunteer in county prisons, and then was asked to become the department head for Arabic and Islamic studies at the Sister Clara Muhammad School in 1978, and left government employment subsequently, served for 15 years in that capacity, and eventually became the assistant director of education. Then after that, in 1994, he helped to start the United Muslim Masjid and became the first resident imam. He helped to form a program here at Penn within the Center of Community Partnerships and worked in that capacity from '96 until 2004. And also served the Muslim Student Association here at Penn as their imam in the office of the chaplain. Imam Durden currently serves as the resident imam for the Philadelphia Masjid and continues to serve as a member of Penn's Religious Community Council. Let's welcome Imam Durden. Okay, so there's a lot of word on the street about whether or not faith and movements for social justice can coexist and how they coexist. How do you see social justice fitting into your faith tradition? And how does your faith influence why you feel led to do social justice work?
Last year we first.
All right.
Again, good evening, everyone. Peace be unto you. Now, I'm sure I can speak for my colleagues up here, but when faith is in your heart, you are compelled not just by revelation from God, but by the examples of those who God has chosen to be receivers of revelation and role models for us to follow. And they all stood up for establishing what is right and then acting upon that when it comes to injustice in the environment. One particular scripture I want to quote in the Quran, in the 22nd chapter, it says, "O you who believe, be firm in standing up for justice, being a witness to what God has required of you, even if it's against yourself or your parents or your relatives, and whether they are rich or poor." And I think those are our priorities. We begin with ourselves and those who are close to us because we know them better and we have more responsibility towards them. So God requires us to be those who try to establish justice and make sure that there's a sense of fairness in all of our relationships, but we have to begin with ourselves and those who are close to us, because the scripture does say charity begins at home and spreads abroad. When you try to help somebody be just, then it's really you're doing something for them. Our prophet has said, if you see an injustice, if you see a wrong, do something about it with your hands. If you can't do anything about it, say something about it. If you can't say anything, at least feel it deeply in your heart so that it disturbs you and you really won't get a good night's sleep until you say something or do something. So again, we are given direction by the one who created us and those who he has chosen to guide us and be examples for us. And I think that's the answer to the first question. I'll pass the mic to Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. So in a way, it's a funny question, because I don't understand why anyone would bother with a faith tradition if it didn't lead to social justice. Like, what's the point? So in Jewish tradition, it's easiest to look at things in threes. We all kind of do that. So I'm going to look at, for a moment, God, Torah, and the people of Israel. So God, we all see God differently. The way that I see God is that God is the power that moves us toward justice. Pure and simple. That God is a power that moves us toward justice. So if we are going to respond to God, that's what we have to do. It's very clear. And we can look biblically and we can look historically and we can find over and over again examples of people who we look to and say, oh, yeah, That's exactly what I want. That's exactly what I need. Because God is the power that moves us toward justice. And sometimes it's in unexpected ways. Like if we look at the story of Abraham, for example, we see a moment where God is about to destroy a city that he's determined is evil, and Abraham stands up and says to God, wait, how can you do that? If you find 50 good people, don't destroy it. And you know the rest of the story, right? It goes down and it doesn't even work. But somehow the way that I understand that story is that God was somehow smiling, because God was the power that gave Abraham the courage to stand up and say to the greatest force in all the world, wait, you got to behave justly. Right? So that's God. That's God. We could spend the next 100 years talking about God. That was my 2-minute God. Like Torah. Torah is in Jewish tradition a couple things. Literally, it means teaching, but it's also the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And then it also is all of the texts that were written afterwards based on the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And we find in all of those a theme. There are countless texts that look back at the Torah and say, this is all about how we have to treat other people. And even if we see models of people where we say, oh, we're not so sure, then what we see in later Jewish texts is people saying, oh, we're not so sure. So we have to understand how they can lead us toward the way that we treat other human beings. And all of that always goes back to the creation story, where we learned that God started creation by creating one being. And in Jewish tradition, we understand that to mean that God created one being, because from that moment on, no one can say, I'm better than anyone else. I'm different from anyone else. I deserve something that no one else deserves, because we are all from the same being. So if somebody across the world is hurting, it is absolutely our obligation to stand up and do something about it. And last is the people. And, the people are always the most challenging. God is easier and books are easier, but people, they get in the way. But, and it's very clear, if we look back at Jewish history, we see people who we're not so proud of, and we see people who we're proud of. And it's up to each one of us to look at the Jewish community and to say, we absolutely are required to follow the example of all of those people who we're proud of. And I loved what you said, Imam, because you were talking about how even if you're going to wind up standing up against something that your family believes or your relatives believe, or even if you have to do that, if you know that something is right, that's it. That's the bottom line. And for me, all of that is really why I'm Jewish and why I bother, because otherwise, what is the point? So.
First, I want to thank the University of Pennsylvania for the privilege to be here. Of course, Dr. Valerie Allen, and it's always good to be with this distinguished. Of course, to see my sister wife, the big part. This is a very good question, particularly related to justice. And when you look at the word justice itself, it's really doing what is just, what is right. And as it relates to my faith tradition, I think about Mother Bethel here in Philadelphia. It was founded because they were not treated justly. I think about Addison Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. That was founded simply because they wanted to worship God. They were told to go up to the balcony to worship God. And so they said, we're not going to go up to the balcony. We're going to start our own church. And so when we look at justice in our tradition, It has simply been our attempt to just be us. And in a real sense, real justice is about you trying to just be yourself. And so when you look at the civil rights movement, and even as you look at movements post-it, all of these movements have been tied back to just trying to be yourself. And I'm reminded of the late Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, who wrote a very powerful book, and he was one of the presidents of Morehouse College. And his book was called Born to Rebel. And I believe that it wasn't just Dr. Mays who was born to rebel, but all of us, if you really believe in justice, that you're born to rebel. So therefore, if you see somebody who is hurting, you must rebel. If you see somebody who is not being treated fairly, then you must rebel. If you see someone who is not being treated with dignity and with respect and was being denied access to quality education, quality housing, then you must rebel. And, you know, it's easy for me to, I tell my friends, I'm always looking for a fight to get into because it's just a part of who I am. Because I want people to experience life, liberty, and what this country does, what the pursuit of what? Justice. And many times we have to understand that our faith traditions are tied to that pursuit. And there's this good story about Dr. King and Dr. Mays and my mentor, Dr. Otis Moss Jr., pastor emeritus of the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church, puts this in Dean Carter's book, Walking Integrity. It's a book that was edited that really focused on the life of Dr. Mays. And I want to read this quote to you because I shared it recently at Reverend Buss's funeral. And Dr. Mays, as he was talking about Dr. King, he said that you must believe that when you tell the truth, that the sun, the moon, and the stars are on your side. You must believe that when you stand up for what is right, all the hosts of heaven, the universe, and the eternal God stand with you. And I share that with you because Dr. Mays shared that with Dr. King. And this is when they were making the decision to go ahead and to lead some major protests. And it was Dr. Mays, because many people don't know this, but Dr. King's father, his father's friends, they were all against him leading major marches. But Dr. Mays was the one who came to the side of Dr. King and said, look, Martin, if you believe in this, I believe in this. But you got to believe that when you stand, that you stand for what is right. And that's why I believe that any faith that matters, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, that if we are really true to the essence of our faith, that the essence of our faith will always make sure that we fight for justice.
I'm doing some editorializing. I got my questions in front of me, but I want to ask a question between the first two questions, because all of you were talking about this notion that faith might actually set you against the status quo, against the cultural patterns and traditions that you are around. Iman learning, you talked about allowing injustice to disturb you out of your sleep, moving your hands and feet to action. Rabbi Linda, you talked about, I like how Dr. Oprah Hendricks says, that justice is treating the people's needs as holy. No matter where you come from, your needs are holy. Dr. Johnson talking about, the ways in which there's sometimes fear in. I mean, I'm sure Dr. King's daddy was afraid. Not because he didn't believe that what Dr. King was doing was right, but because he was scared for his son, right? So how do you suggest that we navigate this political environment that seeks to promote, this is Reverend Naomi's editorializing, a kind of faith that baptizes the status quo, a faith that discourages people from rebelling, from making too much noise. What can you say to that? How should we negotiate this political moment?
This is a very loaded question. Let me go back a few years. I mentioned I was part of a prison ministry in the late 70s, early 80s. And one of our trademarks from the community, and see that the mosque that I am the imam of was founded by Malcolm X in 1959. It was temple number 12 at that time. And he was a product of a prison ministry that really brought him out of the depths. I mean, he was so deep into it that he called himself Satan in jail. And in the early parts of the prison ministry that I was involved in, I remember going on D Block in Holmesburg Prison, being locked in. So once you come in, they lock the gate behind you. And D Block was the most notorious block. It was filled with murderers and all types of criminals, but you would never know it. Because there's a certain, we'll just say, reality when you come to do something to help somebody improve themselves. If they know you are doing something because you love them, they would love to know what you are doing. And so, part of our effort has to be that irregardless of what exists in the environment, whatever the status quo is, we know that the potential and the possibility for not just change, but for improvement, for progress, is only limited by the amount of commitment that we make. That we consider ourselves to be those who are serving God's purpose. Then we have to look at the status quo and say that not only do I accept the things that I can't change, but the things that are unacceptable, I have to change. And that is, I think, the position that we all have to take, because again, the only thing that's constant is change. And change will either be positive or negative. And if good people say and do nothing, then change will always be negative. So, it's really, it's incumbent upon all of us. It really is our own enlightened self-interest. Because there's a saying, we all heard the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, right? But there's another part to that. If the village doesn't raise the child will burn the village down to fill its wall. So we have to, in our own enlightened self-interest, raise these children, change the status quo. Because if we don't, then the consequences we have very little control over, and we can see the results of negative. Because hopefully we're here to try to unwrap the legacy of Martin Luther King. We sort of have wrapped it up in nice, pretty packages with flowery words that are now, I think Reverend Johnson mentioned how, a lot of what the late Dr. Martin Luther King was doing was something that really wasn't acceptable to the status quo. But now that he can speak for himself any longer, we sort of have wrapped him up in a pretty package with bows and flowers on it. And now we have to unwrap it so we can get back to the work.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, really good. Thank you. I don't know if any of you are Jewish, but don't tell me if you are, because I'm going to do something scary in front of other Jews, which is talk about Israel for a moment. So for me, social and political justice, it takes two levels usually. Either justice that is being worked on right here in Philadelphia, in this community, and the second is in Israel, Palestine. But the first time I went to Palestine, to the West Bank, and spent time in Hebron and spent time getting to know people, getting to know who was there, getting to know the work that was doing, I was pretty stunned. I had done a lot of reading and I had done a lot of work to try to support the Palestinian people and done all of that stuff. But I was really stunned about the enormity of occupation in their lives and what it meant. And I came home and looked around at a lot of my colleagues. And if I tried talking about it, I've been told that I'm anti-Semitic. I'm not. I've been told that I must hate Jews. I don't. I give my entire life to working for the Jewish community. But when I see what Israel does, I can't forgive. Not right now, not until we do all of the work that we need to do to get it to change. Because when you see something that is blatantly wrong, you don't give up. So what you do ideally is work in community, work with other people who share your values and your views, work with other people who keep their eyes open. Work with other people who are not going to just say, oh, no, we can't look at that. We, had a hard time in the past and therefore we can't look at it now. And, whatever Israel does is okay. Whatever anyone does is not okay. It is not okay to mistreat another people. It is simply not. So to do that work is not always easy, but there is enough community doing it too. That finding that community and working together for me has made all the difference in my life. So in answer to your question about what we do, when we see the political reality in our country, which is sometimes beyond belief what we're seeing in our country, it's finding each other. It's finding this people with whom we can work together. It's finding people who have a shared vision. And that can make all the difference, even if it can be a little bit frightening.
Yeah.
So.
I think the Reverend Washington Lee part for the question about this current political environment, because it's very toxic. But when you look at the foundation of this toxicity, it really has its roots in Christianity. And it took, and I never forget, this was during the pandemic. I had done this Bible study, and I really wanted to try to dig a little bit deeper, particularly after George Floyd and the silence, particularly my white brothers and sisters in Christian faith who were silent. And I started to really look at it. There's a good book that's out there that talks about the foundation. I'll get it to you in a few minutes, but it talks about the foundation of white supremacy and its tie to Christianity. And when you look at the early foundations of this and white supremacy, and you begin to see the birth of this country, even just when you look at the manifesto and even just sanctioning to come to this land, what we now call as North America, it was sanctioned by the Catholic Church. That this was a place where you could come and this would be quote unquote the promised land. And so the church, I want you to understand how all these things come together, has really been the proponents of the political toxic environment that we currently have. And then when you start to look at how this ties into power and economics and how Christianity has been used not to advance the faith, but to advance power, then you start to look at it from a totally different lens. And even now, when you look at what Ron DeSantis, and matter of fact, he will be coming to the Union League. And there's a big protest that's going to be at the Union League tomorrow at 5 o'clock because Ron DeSantis is going to be receiving the highest honor that the Union League can possibly give out. This It's about and I am sharing this with you because this is, again, you look at what Ron DeSantis has been doing, and you look at his attack on African American studies, and then it switched today to dealing with those who are LGBTQ persons from their community, and then he's trying to link the two together. And so I'm sharing this with you because it still goes back to this false understanding of Christianity and the environment that in which we live right now is that I firmly believe in order to really begin to address this, it used to be you try to address it from a faith standpoint. Now you got to address it from a straight up bigotry, ignorance, white supremacy standpoint, because we are in a terrible fight for the soul of this nation. And I appreciate, wherever you fall on a political spectrum, I appreciate some attempts. But when I look at somebody who is as smart as Ron DeSantis, and he's not dumb, he went to Harvard now. But he is someone that they are starting to now use to continue this thread of creating this Judeo-Christian narrative that America is only for those who are white evangelical Christian. And so we have to begin to address these issues. And I believe that the faith community can no longer be silent.
Wow, God, y'all, I see y'all in there. So pivoting a bit to how you've seen social justice movements, and particularly faith-rooted social justice movements, change over time. I mean, so we've talked about how injustice has kind of morphed and shape-shifted, but it's still kind of the same bigotry, right? But how have social justice movements, you think, evolved either to accommodate faith? How has faith forced those movements to evolve? Any kind of variation on that question?
Yeah, I think when we go back when movements began, and we probably have to go back to what Rabbi Holtman said, but Adam and Eve. That was the first movement. But anyway, in protest movements of a political and social nature in this country, we can go to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and we can see chronic conditions that were baked into the institutions that produced a paradigm for people who were disenfranchised to have to live in. And that was a chronic condition, meaning it affected all of us. No matter what your status was, I think when they redlined, then we were all a part of that reservation and we couldn't get out. And that was a chronic condition. And the protest movement dealt with chronic conditions. I think one thing that doesn't always help us today is when attention is placed on acute problems. And here's what I mean when I say that. Voter suppression is an acute problem. And acute problems are painful to the emotions, to the psyche, to the spirit. It's an acute problem. And we have to address it because it's painful. But there's a chronic condition also that exists that we used to deal with that the social justice movement has sort of forgotten. And that chronic condition is that only maybe 15% of the people in Philadelphia who are disenfranchised vote. That's a chronic condition. And it's not being addressed. If they try to have poll watchers sent out, because I was part of Reverend Allen's movement with the election protection in the 2016 election. And we were looking at a threat to voting. We were looking at voting suppression, or voter suppression, but the majority of disenfranchised people, our families, didn't even bother to register to vote. or come out. So I think the social justice movement is to deal, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We have to deal with the acute problems because they are disturbing to the human spirit and psyche. But we also have to look at the chronic condition. And I think the COVID sort of brought that out. It let us see an acute issue. But those who had chronic conditions were affected the most.
Yep.
And so now that the acute problem has exposed a chronic condition, the social justice movement, even if it doesn't, even if we can't resolve the acute problem, because sometimes we're not in a position to do it. We don't have the levers of power. But we can deal with the chronic condition because it's our own families. If you got children, make sure that number one, and we're speaking to men and women, make sure that number one, you are raising your children. You are taking care of them, you're providing their needs. But if you know they have if they are citizens in this country, then they have an obligation to make certain that they are represented. And the one way to make certain is to vote. So again, I think the social justice movement has gotten away from chronic conditions because it's much easier to get play, to get media, to have a platform if you deal with something that is acute. And I'll leave you with this when it comes to this issue here. There was a rabbi, a minister, and an imam. And they came across a person at night in the street, going up and down in the gutter, frantically looking for something. And so they felt moved to help this person. And so they joined him and they spent hours walking back and forth in the gutter because he was looking for something that he lost. And so after a few hours, they said, "Are you sure that you lost it here?" He said, "No, I didn't lose it here, I lost it over there." They said, "Well, why are you looking here?" But this is where they're showing the light. This is where the light is at. Sometimes the light is put on part of a problem. The 6 o'clock news. We see what's highlighted. And it creates a sense of anxiety and urgency. But the problem originates in the shadows. They never shine the light in the shadows. They always put it on the one who's in the gutter. So you can see his, with just a disoriented activity. So again, as people of faith, we can't allow ourselves to be manipulated by where they focus the attention.
Absolutely.
Because they will keep us with a high sense of urgency and anxiety. I mean, of course, we want to confront DeSantis. But if he's taken African-American studies out of Florida, he can't take it out of the homes of the people in Florida. And the people in Florida, if they teach their children at home, then DeSantis can't take anything from them. All he can do is expose himself. And again, you know, we have an acute problem, we have a chronic problem. We have to give attention to both. Let's chew gum and walk at the same time.
That's a great story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So the Jewish community is interesting around social justice and complicated. So if we think about the history of the Jewish community in the past, 100 years, it's been difficult. Like there was a Holocaust. It did happen. It certainly in my family and in the family of almost everyone I know who came from anywhere around Eastern Europe, we lost a lot of people. It was. Out of that grew a kind of fear of making yourself vulnerable, of doing too much that was gonna be, that was gonna possibly put you in danger. When you're talking about Martin Luther King and his father not wanting him to march, I was thinking, of course he would have wanted to march. My mother wouldn't have let me march either. I mean, I get that completely. And it was all out of that kind of vulnerability. And in my life, that's not real anymore. It's not real. Of course, there's anti-Semitism, but it's not everywhere, under every rock and it's not. In this country, it's certainly there and it's real and it's painful and we have to work against it because we have to work against discrimination against everybody all the time. But this country was based on racism. It's really clear. This country was based, we started with enslavement and went on from there. That's the sin at the center of the United States, and it really is. So for us as Jews, and we're majority white, we're not all white by any means, there are many Jews of color, but right here in the United States now, we are overwhelming majority white. And sometimes the Jewish community looks back and says, oh, but we marched with Martin Luther King. Oh, we were there. And that's not good enough. It's about being here right now and never forgetting what really is going on in this country. Absolutely. So when it comes to what's happening, at least in the Jewish world, around social justice, I think there's more of an awakening now than there has been in quite a while. Because people are being given a lot of flack. Like, what do you mean the last time you can look back and say we marched with Martin Luther King? He hasn't been around marching for a while. What are you doing now? And that, at least, I see like people waking up, maybe because we're a few generations away from the Holocaust, so we can get away from that feeling of endangerment and constantly being afraid. But it feels as if there's something more happening now. So what I find, and part of that, that ridiculously huge bio that you read about me and talked about, I haven't done that one. Talked about power and being involved with power. Pennsylvanians organized to witness of power and rebuild. And it's a multi-faith organization in Philadelphia. And there are a lot of meetings. There are a lot of Jews. And we speak up a lot. And I find myself very proud because it's about time. And we really need to take a look at this country and see what's really going on there and be ready to stand up. So I'm hoping that in the Jewish world, this is a sign of things to come. But I don't know, invite me back in another 15 years and I'll tell you.
I think this is another good question as it relates to social justice and how it has evolved. In December, I had the privilege to go down to Montgomery, Alabama, and I was there 67 Montgomery bus boycott keynote speaker. And I had the privilege to, a good friend of mine, he's the mayor there, we were in college together. But it was at the Hope Street Baptist Church. And I would tell you, when you look at those images, when they were gathering at Hope Street to prepare for the Montgomery bus boycott, that you would think that it is big like Enon or big like Rodolph Shalom, but it was not. I mean, the church is probably no bigger, the inside of the sanctuary no bigger than this room. And what it said to me is that it's not the size of the crowd, it's the commitment of the crowd. And that is something that I worry about each and every year. The Bible talks about us in the old Hebrew Bible, you know, we have become at ease in Zion. And I wrote this article in the Tribune right after the George Floyd hit and Justin. been out there protesting. I was arrested with Al Sharpton, Amadou Diallo, and I can just kind of go down my rap sheet of what I've done on social justice programs. But one of the things that kind of shifted for me and again, I was involved with helping out with power on the steps of the school district with Dwayne and with Marta. But what I wrote this article was it a movement or a moment? And I share that with us because we are so narcissistic that we want to record everything and post everything. And one of my biggest fears right now with social justice from Washington elite part is that this generation, like, you know, I was watching folk right after George Floyd and both were taking pictures, like I'm marching, like this is my civil rights moment. And I'm like, that's not what this is about. It's not how many likes you have. It's not how many views you have, but it is about, are you committed to this work? And my prayer is that, and trust me, those who, it's just like with the, kind of going back to the Union League, they are hoping that they understand, just like with Colin Kaepernick and with kneeling, they are hoping that it is just a moment. And the question is, can we turn this into a movement? And again, I go back to the Montgomery bus boycott. You have to understand what they did. Is that for over a year, they decided that they were not going to take public transportation. And as I concluded my speech, I said, actually, the city of Montgomery, not matter of fact, it's actually the founders of Uber and Lyft, they actually owe the citizens of Montgomery a check because they stole their rideshare idea. That's where the first rideshare platform started. And we're talking about no cell phones, no apps, but yet the women there in the city, they organized a rideshare program. They had about 1,300 stops a day picking up people, all without a mobile app, all without a cell phone. They worked it. And so for me, if we can be that creative and be that committed, it's going to require that and then some in this current generation.
Absolutely.
Speaking of bridging generations, right? You know, we were raising a 16-year-old in my house, you know, just. And so much is dictated by the TikTok clock, right? And so, and we know at the same time, here in Philadelphia, we are experiencing a plague of violence. I said to somebody today earlier, I said, this is a plague.
Oh, yeah, clearly.
What are your thoughts about particularly how religious communities can address the reduction and eventually elimination of violence in our community? It feels like such an insurmountable task. But what are your thoughts about what we can do?
Well, there's a focus on the places that our youth inhabit. The DA's office, not just, but actually Reverend Holston from the DA's office, he has the 57 block program where many of the violent crimes take place in 57 blocks in the city. 5% of the land mass, maybe 70% of the violence. And so focusing on individuals, and you know, all the TikTok generation, we want to call them that, they inhabit cyberspace. They're not in any place, so you really can't find them unless you're in cyberspace with them. And they have so many different platforms. I'm still on Facebook. Yeah. And so it's they're always finding a place to go. So rather than dealing with the individuals, This focus is dealing with the places that we live in. And here's one thing the late Reverend Gray said I never forgot. And he was our congressman as well as Bright Hope pastor. Was it Bright Hope?
Yeah.
He said that when he was growing up, he could remember seeing the trash man come home, seeing the doctor come home, the lawyer come home, the engineer, the school teacher, because we all lived as a community in a neighborhood. Now all the neighbors are gone and the hood is the only thing that is left. And this is what is producing an environment where ideas from cyberspace can take root because the children or the inhabitants of our neighborhoods really are not rooted to any viable institutions, whether we're talking about family, school, work, etc. So the approach that is being suggested is that the institutions, especially the faith-based institutions, begin to take responsibility for a 3 to 4 block radius. And here's what that is going to require of us. And again, we have a status quo because most of us who have gotten anything have gotten out. And the ones that are left behind are those who are really the weakest and the most vulnerable, and those who have been the most victimized, and so they become victimizers themselves. So the approach has to be, you know how communities are gentrified by colonizers and settlers coming in. We have to go back to our roots. And where we have strong institutions, it's unfortunate Mother Bethel is in a neighborhood with their multi-million-dollar dwellings. And the people who actually were the indigenous inhabitants of those neighborhoods were not permitted to acquire any of that wealth. And they basically were driven out by settlers and colonizers. And they call it gentrifying. Now, we have to look at those institutions that we value, whether they are churches, whether they are public institutions, whether they are social institutions, and begin to gentrify those areas, even if we don't move back. We have to declare this is a blight-free zone. Where they have a drug-free zone, this is the blight-free zone around this valued institution. Because you can't have good schools without good neighborhoods. You can't have a good religious community if right outside the doors after we get the message on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, we see degradation that we can't do or won't do anything about. We have to value our institutions so much. But just as that zygote is valued in the womb, and it begins the mitosis, it begins to the cell division until it reaches critical mass, and then you have an entity that is viable. And we look at if our institutions are valuable, we can't allow blight to exist around them because we know that blight is not only going to kill the life, but it's going to create an environment where degradation can exist. And if the degradation exists in the physical environment, and that's where it begins, it's much easier for it to now attach itself to the spirit and the soul. Because our youth, they grow up in a blighted environment. So when they encounter blight in cyberspace, it's unnatural, but it's normal to them. And they incorporate it and they make it a part of his life, and it has an effect on them that can be so deep rooted. It's going to take some generations to really disengage. But the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And remember, how do you eat the elephant? One bite at a time. And when the elephant comes to the village, where does he sit?
Wherever he wants.
Anywhere he wants. What? And can't see a human being on top of the elephant, putting the elephant to work. if he uses his intelligence, because we can outsmart an elephant. If we can't, then the elephant will sit anywhere he wants. And that's what cyberspace is. We have to get on top of it, and you don't get on top of it by going into cyberspace. We deal with the physical environment because God created us in a physical environment and a garden of Eden, so to speak. And we are tempted sometimes to leave the garden. So let us be those who look at the places where we have our institutions. And to the extent that we can, let us declare this is a blight-free zone. We don't want human blight. We don't want physical blight. We don't want spiritual blight. We want to begin to have an effect in our environment because people are products of the environment that they come out of to a large extent. We know there are other factors, but if you do have the right environment, the majority of the people will be right. And one statistic that we can't overlook, 70% of the disenfranchised people among the Black inner city residents or inhabitants come from broken families, from male and female, didn't make any commitment to each other. So we know there's no commitment to the child, and in many cases, it's on both parts. So we have to begin to look at the reality of the status quo, and we have to change the things that are unacceptable.
Thank you. We have to look at a lot of places, and I think we want things to happen fairly quickly. And we want the plague of gun violence, which really, it does feel like a plague. I mean, it feels like a plague. And we have to get over the fact that, we think we're immune to it, right? If we live in a block that we think of as safe, or we live in we have to get over all of that. Last summer, my neighbor's son was killed by gun violence. He wasn't home, he was at a party. But this was a kid who, for no reason, this really lovely 18-year-old, that's it, his life was finished. So what can we do? And what his parents are doing is talking and talking and talking. And they've been on the radio, and they've been on everywhere that they can go to just make it very clear that it isn't an us and them. There's somehow this other group of people, and we don't have to worry about them. This is all of us. We are all in this together. So I think starting with realizing that we are all in this together really helps. Second, am I allowed to say something negative about the mayor? So, okay. All right, thanks. So as part of an anti-gun violence group with power, we met with the mayor, we met with the police commissioner, we met with lots of other people, and what we realized, but by the end of it, was that there were people who had interesting ideas about gun violence, but there was no total organized, everybody working together, holding people accountable, really in this as one. And there's a desperate need for that to happen. Yeah. So recently, the people we've been meeting with are people who've been successful in other cities. Like Oakland has had a huge amount of success lowering their gun violence rate. And they've had interesting programs. Probably among the most interesting is a program where they target kids who they see as the most vulnerable, like kids who could either most likely be killed or killed because of where they are, because of their life circumstance, because of what they've been doing, and they work with them. And they figure out what they need. And there has to be a fair amount of money involved. And there has to be helping kids who need food get food, and helping them get support, and helping them have people to talk to. And not just saying, we're going to come in and hold you accountable like police on the outside, and then we're never going to be there for you, but actually being there for them. And by trying to do this with not an enormous number of people, they've lowered the gun violence rate in Oakland tremendously. But it took the Oakland City to be one organized force, joining them together. So what we said to the people with whom we met who worked there, what does the faith community do? What did the faith community in Oakland do that helps? And they said the faith community had to be there too. Like, you needed people to be there with the kids, to help us, to hold us accountable, to not let us off the hook, to make sure that we are really doing the work that we need to do in order to get gun violence lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered. And the faith community can have that kind of power if we're ready to do the work. And it takes a lot of work. And it takes, I think, it's important. I think that there's an imam and a pastor and a rabbi and a pastor sitting at this table, because it takes all of us. So that's it. I talk about finding something horrible and desperately wanting us to hold the city accountable and do that work and push it ahead. Absolutely. We can help.
The rabbi and the imam, they said everything I wanted to say. So what I will say is this, and I like them. I have been actively involved in trying to address these issues, fighting for funding, fighting to make sure that there's no that we get rid of guns on the streets, etc. But I don't really think anything is going to change until we really start to value Black life.
Oh, yeah.
That in and of itself,
Yeah,
really begins to shift everything.
Yeah.
And we don't value Black life in our schools. We don't value Black life in health. We don't value Black life as it relates to our communities. And until we address that issue, and because I listened to Rabbi Holtzman, what took place in Oakland, is because they collectively said we're going to value.
Yeah. Absolutely. Here.
I'm going to invite you all to ask questions in just a minute. I just sitting with me as we reflect on this question. I recently got into this show, Your Honor, on Showtime. It's not a plug show. And on Sunday night, so last night, I watched a new episode, and one of the characters is a mother whose son was killed in a car. He was hit by a car and died. And so she's been going to this grief group in the show because her daughter's like, "You're so angry, you have an anger problem. I need you to go work through that, go process that." So she's in the grief group, being terrible, being a jerk to all of the people. Y'all in here whining about your losses, what you're gonna do. And then she has this pivotal revelation in her own mind and spirit. She comes back to the group, she apologizes, and she said, "You all have been trying to move me through the stages of grief." And then she's like, "Oh, denial and anger, whatever they are, toward acceptance." She said, "I'm in the anger stage." She said, "And I don't want to move." I mean, this was a critical scene in the show. Y'all should watch the show, it's for the show. And so it dawned on me in that moment, as we think about the proliferation of violence in Philadelphia, how tethered anger is to grief, to sadness.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that religious communities are uniquely qualified and capable of helping people live with chronic sadness, chronic grief, and move through that in a way that is generative and not self-destructive.
Yes.
Seems to me that we have tears running through our streets.
Yes.
The tears come before the blood.
Yeah.
And so you all talking reminded me of this scene last night. It was so far. She was just like, I don't want to. I'm comfortable. I'm happy here in this anger, and she's destroying herself from the inside out in the show. Right? It's going to really destroy her and destroy the ones she loves. But she's like stuck there.
Yeah.
You know, and so we can give language to the sadness, to the grief. We've got rituals for the grief. We got ways we can move people through the grief. So that just,
And to the anger, right? Like I mean, what we learned is not to be afraid of anger and not to run away from it, but to like work it through and to work it out. And that is something that, you learn when you go to school to become an imam or a pastor or and you do these things. So we've got the skills. So like, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned the show and the anger. See, we can see a homicide. We can see the chalk line in the street. That's a sign that something has been violated. And someone is the violator. And and it's a sickness. It's really a mental health issue. It's a health problem.
Yeah.
And when we have a health problem and we go and seek medical assistance, the doctor generally will just look at the signs, but they'll never ask you how you feel or what the symptoms. And sometimes they'll look at red eyes and say, well, he must have been drinking. But it could be he has high blood pressure, or it could be some other issue or condition. And too often we don't find out these youth, they're angry.
Yes.
And they love being angry because now it gives them a profile where they can, they can manifest strength. But why are they angry? Maybe they were, as Dr. Johnson said, there's no value in Black life. There's no value in their neighborhood. They grow up in a neighborhood where there's no value assigned to it. Even the property values are stolen by redlining. And so if there's no value, then he doesn't feel valued, but everything around him has a value assigned to it. And he may be angry, he may be hateful, he may be resentful. This is what he is feeling. And then he shows signs that are antisocial. And all we see is the sign that says he's an antisocial person. But we never sit him down and find out how is he feeling. Where did this come from? And if we know where it came from, then it is on us to deal with the acute problem, because some of them have to be dealt with. But we also have to look at the chronic condition. And we have to assign value to everyone should have a basic value. And that's human dignity, and it is the right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you know how Thomas Jefferson defined the pursuit of happiness? They changed the wording, but it's the accumulation or the acquisition of material values. Because that's what, if you take values away from people, you can really, and we know that life is more than just material stuff. But when you deprive young life, and they feel the deprivation because they're surrounded by others who are not deprived, then it diminishes them. And they have feelings that they don't even understand. They're angry and don't even know why they're angry. They're hateful and don't even know why they're hateful. These are symptoms because no one ever takes the time to diagnose cause and effect. We simply look at the effects if we don't deal with the cause, and that's where the social and the religious community, all the movements have to now compare notes as you did in Oakland. And we have to realize that there are signs and there are symptoms. And the signs and the symptoms lead to a syndrome. And when the two coincide, then we have the gun violence problem. So most of the youth who are perpetrators, they were victims first. And we know the Stockholm syndrome. And many of them don't even realize the enormity of what they did until they spent maybe 20 or 30 years inside a prison cell. And then they finally dawns on them that I can now manage, or I can now control my feelings. Now I see what drove me to what I did. But the signs are there for us to see. If you see a degraded neighborhood with bad schools, that's a sign that there's something that is not being valued properly in a country where property values are projected in the media 24/7. Values are projected 24/7, and the ones who don't find themselves as part of that projection, how are they going to feel? They're going to feel inferior, they're going to feel disenfranchised, and they're going to overcompensate by doing things that will give them a false sense of power. And these youth, all of them carry guns. All of them. And every time we take a gun from one, there's someone ready to give them another gun. So they all have guns, but that's the only power they have. They don't have the power of the mind. They don't have the power, the ability to come naturally to be part of a family and a community. So we see the signs, but we have to know now what are the symptoms, because every sign doesn't always relate to something that you can just measure with a criminal justice code. And again, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time.
We got time for one or two, one question from the audience. Yeah, can we?
What part do you think 4 years of administration, how young people look at violence and the disparity between what they see and how our government officials reacted to that kind of leadership?
Yeah.
And not standing up to it.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I just wanted to mention that sometimes when you talk to young people, you have to begin by telling them you have a right to be angry about certain things.
Absolutely.
And that opens up the door to be able to have a real relationship with them. You know, and I did that for over 30 years that I worked for the Department of Human Services. And it's a bigger problem. There's no magic bullet for what we're dealing with now. But I look at that administration and I say, if you can elect the president and not hold him accountable for anything,
Yes.
even an insurrection,
Yes.
you can't hold him accountable for that. Nobody has the cojones to say, my life was in danger in that room, but
I'm going to repeat the question for the benefit of everybody and the folks who are on Zoom. The question was basically, how did the Trump administration and its kind of recklessness influence young people today, and particularly the lack of courage from other elected officials to stand up to the recklessness of that administration? How does that create the sort of plague that we see today?
Okay.
Again, this is a good question. Thank you so much, brother, for raising that question. For me, I think that it's beyond even Trump. I mean, there has been this, there was a good CNN did a good job looking at America's mayor, looking at Rudy Giuliani. And really, Giuliani was the precursor to a Trump.
Yeah.
And when you look at the postmodern world in which we live, And for me, this is what postmodernism is. It is the deconstruction of societal norms so that it benefits people who are in power. It is destruction of societal norms so that it benefits people in power. And what Trump was effective at doing is saying that the laws do not apply to me. And what he was really saying, the laws don't apply to white males. And so therefore you can look at this whole evolution of what is truth, you know, and he did a good job of that. And then when you look at the law and order issue, and this is where the young people, it comes in, is that they're saying to themselves, if you're not going to hold him accountable, then how can you hold me accountable? And then it ties back to this whole issue of value and whose life is valued. And even with, you know, how can Trump take files to his house? And now we know that even Biden did, but it still ties back to value. That had been Barack Obama.
Oh, please.
Oh, he would have been locked up in prison by now.
Yep.
And this issue of value, even as it relates to the Imam was talking about with redlining, you know, the neighborhood has not changed, you know. The block, the square footage of that house has not changed. What has changed is the occupant of that address that has changed. And so therefore, again, this whole issue about value is that if it's a Black person that is there, it's not valuable. But if that same house, a white person, and they don't have to move a couch into the house, it what? Increases in value. And so these are issues that, you know, even as I look at my kids from the UPenn, University of St. Alexander, Penn Alexander School, the way that school started out, it was very diverse.
Yeah.
But now that school, you can't even find anybody brown in that school anymore. Again, value. And I think that what Trump administration really did is really begin to push this white nationalist, this whole viewpoint that if you're not white, then you're not black.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. And I would say not just white, although for tonight when we're talking about it, absolutely. I would say straight white Christian man. And that's what has value. And anything else does not have value. And that message got across really, really clearly. And that meant that the way that he got away with, as he saw it, doing anything, the level of misogyny, the treatment of women, kind of beyond belief, and putting that on the national stage for the leader, supposedly the leader of the free world, right? Doing that in face of the entire world. What does that say to kids? It's really clear. It's really clear. Oh, that's okay. First of all, it says that's okay to do, which is truly horrible. But it also says really clearly that's okay for a straight white Christian man to do because he's really worth something. Like I know if I did something like that, if I'm a person of color or I'm a woman or I'm queer or I'm going to really be in deep trouble. But he could get away with it. And the next generation sees that. How could they not see it? And it carries on generation to generation. And boy, we have to stand up strongly in the face of that because we have been given what a mess. And of course it didn't start with Trump. Like if there hadn't been the levels of racism and the levels of anti-Semitism and the levels of misogyny and the levels of right there in the country, he couldn't have done any of that, of what he did. Right? I don't know if any of you watched Saturday Night Live. Yeah. But you remember right with the week after the election when he was elected, and they did a show where there was a party and about half of the people at the party were Black and half of the people were white. And as the vote is shifting and they're watching Hillary lose and Trump win, all of the white people are saying, I don't know where this came from. I don't know how this could possibly happen. And all of the Black people in the room are saying, We have to all open our eyes and say, yeah, this is here in our country. And what he did was highlight it and make it okay for a next generation. And boy, we have to work hard to end that and to stop it and to not let it be perpetuated. Yeah.
I see we have one person who has a question. I'm looking at the clock, I'm looking at my bosses. Y'all help me.
If it is a short question,
Okay,
I don't know where
it's right here.
a short question, a short answer.
One word.
I'm the author of Martin L. King Jr. on politicians at Harvard. I just want to make a quick observation real quickly. Number one, talking about the youth. What can we do for the youth? We have to remember, if we go back and we think about Martin. Martin King involved his youth in his movement.
Yeah.
And he got a lot of flack for that. So we have to ask ourselves, what have we done? And see, because the reason why our youth are in the predicament that we're in, but that's something I want us to all think about, is like, what have we done for the youth? And the second thing is, Trump was not an aberration.
Yeah.
Trump was, but he was a personification of what was being spoken at the kitchen table.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
the people that were speaking out, whites in particular,
Yep.
white liberals in particular, they were embarrassing Trump more so than anything else. So we got to switch to what fully going on. And that's why we have lost our fit, because we have not followed it.
I'm gonna cut you off. I'm gonna cut you off. Thank you. What the question was?
It's not, this is an exclamation point.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Panel around.
I just want to again thank the panelists and thank our moderator. These are certainly some pearls of wisdom. And I think about Maya Angelou had a poem, and the last line of the poem was, "We are more alike, my friend, than we are different."
Oh, yeah.
And so I think one of the things about having this diversity that you do begin to see that.
Yep.
So I want to thank you all. We do have one more speaker, who is Reverend William Gibson. He's the special advisor to the vice president, leading a range of projects both on and off campus. Gibson has held a range of roles on campus. He first came to the campus in 1996, where he was the university's first African-American chaplain and special advisor to the president. In 2008, he was invited to take on the role of the Associate Vice President for Equity and Access, where he led programs that supported individuals of all ages and backgrounds, including first-generation low-income students, military veterans, and many more. Reverend Gibson is a man of God. And I'm not going to read this whole bio, but I want to tell you that I am so proud to call Reverend Gibson a trusted advisor and friend.
Yes.
He is someone that we call on and he comes. And that's what you need. And so, Reverend Gibson, could you please come up and give us a I don't say it if it's not true.
All right.
I too, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank you all for this rich opportunity. Each of you, for everything you had to say, just really penetrated deeply. And Reverend Washington, be part, unlike Sister Isabel says, Matt, I remember you when you were an undergraduate. Here you are running things. Deeply spiritual, wise and intelligent ways.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm a Baptist preacher, so I'm not going to be long. But I'm gonna read one scripture to you, and it might strike your ear as odd as a way of including this, but I'm gonna unpack it very quickly. Romans 12:2, it reads, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what it is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. I grew up primarily in Southern Baptist churches. My father was a minister. He passed away. He was pastoring the Midwest, Indiana. I come from a tradition where the emphasis is not on creeds and doctrines, but on ethics. Meaning, how do you live out your faith? So when the elders would say, have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. Do you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. Do you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. And it goes, do you love everybody? Certainly, Lord. Do you love everybody? Then go, do you treat everybody right? So it wasn't until I got to college that this world, I want you to hear me, this worldly way of thinking about Christianity messed me up for a while. It was white evangelical religion, in which the world had everything to do with, did you party last night? What did you do with that person last night? Did you smoke? Thanks be to God. When I went to seminary, I came home again. That when I read the scripture to you about conforming to this world, it's the world this panel talked about, of power and abuse and disrespect. That's the world that these religious leaders are not conforming to. And they have renewed our minds to dare to imagine, if I might, kind of world filled with justice and righteousness, and to do the work of Tacoma, to build it.
Yeah.
You dare to imagine it, and you build it.
Yeah.
So the next time you hear that scripture, don't allow white evangelical kinds of theologies to mess you up. It's a revolutionary text there. Be not conformed to a world that says black and brown bodies are less, LGBTQ lives are less. Don't be conformed to that world, but let your mind be renewed, and then to build the new world. So we're not making idols out of Dr. King. We're not making idols out of a moment. We're here for the movement.
Yeah.
And the movement begins with transformed minds.
Yeah.
Tear this world down and build a new one.
Yeah.
God bless you all.
Wow. I don't even know how to follow that. My goal is just simply to say thank you and good night. I'm Hillary King. I'm the director of FEND. It's been a privilege and honor to work with Val and Isabel for the last few years planning these events. Yeah, thank you. All I can say is thank you and good night. I am a Jewish mother, so please go get more food and take it home so that we don't have to pack it up. Thank you to our lovely panel. It's been a pleasure meeting some of you, working with you again, seeing some friendly faces in the audience and some new faces, and we hope to have you at future events. Thank you. Have a wonderful night.